Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 13. The Riverside Sentinel's break room was cramped, hosting a refrigerator, sink, microwave, several file cabinets, a small table, 2 chairs, and a copy machine. But it did, at least, have a window. I stood by the fridge and watched as Val poured warm water over Isabel's wounded arm from a clean coffee mug, muttering about how she wished she had something better. The bite marks looked shallower than I thought they would be when the blood was washed away from them. Sweat beaded above Val's bright green eyes. The younger woman winced as the water hit her arm, but my editor simply continued washing the wound with a look of concentration on her face. Val didn't hesitate even when Isabel audibly whimpered and quickly started dabbing the edges of the wound dry with paper towels before reaching for the gauze and wrapping Isabel's arm with a practiced swiftness. "All right," Val said when she was finished. "I can't give you medical advice, but I think you should be okay so long as you get the vaccine as soon as possible and keep an eye out for infection. The doctor will probably also give you some antibiotic ointment. Make sure you use it." Isabel shook her head. "I told you, I can't—" "If you can't go to the ER locally, you'll have to get down to Fairview," Val said. I don't think—" "We already told you how serious this is." Val glanced at me, and I nodded in support. "You've got no reason to roll the dice with your life," she said. "You got bit by a potentially rabid animal, so you need the shot, and that's that. For now, you need to elevate that arm." Val fixed Isabel with a glare so intense that the resistance in the blonde woman's face crumpled. Val grasped Isabel's arm and moved it up over her head. "Hold it there for at least 15 minutes, Val said. Then she turned and looked in my direction. "If you'll excuse us, I need to talk to Eliza for a moment." Val walked toward the doorway and gestured for me to follow her. I fell into line and walked behind my editor. "What's this about?" I asked. Val was silent as she pulled open the door to the stairwell. She held the door open, waiting for me until I entered the dimly lit space. The stairwell smelled of the old, worn wood of the steps and railings. Val let the heavy door close behind us. "It's about Zev," Val said. My eyes widened. Val sighed and turned away from me, pulling off her cap and clutching it in her hands. "Zev has been reported missing." I gasped. "What?" I said. "No, but you told me." "I know," Val said, clenching her teeth. "I'm sorry." "No, it couldn't be true." I wanted to laugh. This had to be a joke. But Val's expression was serious. She wasn't kidding. It slung into me like a sledgehammer. My hands were shaking. Wetness started blurring my vision. This couldn't be. It couldn't. But if Zev was really missing, then the person Mel had seen him carrying out the burning building may actually have meant him harm or may even have kidnapped him. And if the police were only just now starting to search for him days later— Val looked like she was about to rip her hat in half with emotion. I couldn't tell if it was out of anger or guilt. "How is this possible?" I burst out. My voice was so heated that it surprised me. I sounded like I was pissed at Val. And maybe I was. She had told me not to worry. I had tried to tell her that Zev was in trouble, but she hadn't believed me. "His mom thought he was playing hooky from the funeral," Val said. It seemed that, in light of the situation, Val no longer felt the need to make an overture of confidentiality about where Zev was. "And the school," Val said. "Well—" "Wait," I said. "That woman with the hurt arm, she might know something." "What?" "She knew Angela Miller, the missing woman from Zev's notes." I said. "We have to—" "No," Val said flatly. I just stared at her, incredulous. "What?" I demanded, clenching my fists. "I'll take care of this," Val said. "You need to stay out of it. No, I said. I'm the one who found the lead. You need to go home, Val snapped. Eliza, I know, okay? I know what you were to each other. My anger fizzled, replaced by confusion. What was Val talking about? Anyone could see the way you two were with each other, Val said. I saw the parking tags on your van. There's only one reason you'd need to buy a parking pass for a college you no longer go to. I just blinked at her. How could anyone confuse the antagonistic friendship Zev and I had for romance? I'm not an idiot, Elle. I don't know why you kept it a secret. Hell, I thought it was cute. What? No, I wasn't. Val interrupted me again. I'm sorry I didn't take you more seriously before, Val said, but I just figured you guys were having a fight. I thought that was why you didn't know about the funeral, and when I called the school, they said he was accounted for. But I should have listened to you. No, I said. You've got this all wrong. We weren't dating. Val sighed and put her cap back on. I don't care what you want to call it, she said. You're too close to this. I'm putting you on forced leave. What? With pay, Val said. This is going to be a tough time for you, Elle. I think you should go home, be with family, and hope for the best. I could tell what Val was thinking, that it was only a matter of time until Zev's body was discovered. If she really thought I was involved with him, she wanted me to be around people who could take care of me when I found out he was dead. But I wasn't dating him. I could handle it. I could help. I had to help. Even if Zev wasn't my boyfriend, he was still important to me. I can't just walk away, I said. I can help you talk to the police. No, Val shouted, with so much volume and authority that I took a physical step back from her. There's no way in hell, Val continued more calmly. You need to stay far away from this, far away from the temptation to go poking around. Do you even understand how serious this is? Vigilantism is a crime, Elle. You're a reporter, not a cop. I stood there. My mouth started to move, but no words were coming out. I wanted to tell Val that Zev really wasn't my boyfriend, but I didn't think I could convince her. And even if I could, she didn't seem likely to change her mind about putting me on paid leave. I was shell-shocked by the news that Zev really was missing. But I knew that I didn't want to go back to Indiana, especially not now, when everything in my life seemed to be falling apart. I didn't want to face my father, to deal with his pressure and badgering about how it wasn't too late to go to trade school. So I started mumbling the first objection that came into my mind. What about the papers? I'll take care of the next editions. But I don't want to hear it, Val said. She pointed to the bag that was slung over my shoulder. I want you to leave your laptop on your desk and go home. I looked up at Val and met her glaring, bright green eyes with my own darker green ones. I wasn't going to be able to stare Val down. Her gaze was unwavering. And there was no point in arguing. Val wasn't going to budge. Damn it. I hated it, but Val was right. I was a reporter, not a police detective. And it was true that I was far from objective when it came to this situation. I was deeply upset. I was in shock. Zev couldn't be dead. He couldn't be. But how could he just go missing? And why the hell did it take so long for the police to catch on? It was Burke, that asshole. He'd ignored Mel, and he'd ignored me. I wanted to drive down to the police station and punch his stupid, shiny, bald head. No, getting myself arrested would just make things worse. I sighed heavily and blinked tears out of my eyes. Tears of anger, frustration, and despair. I turned my head away from Val. I didn't want her to see me crying, but I was sure she knew. I'll give you a minute, Val said. Leave the laptop in the office before you go. I heard the heavy door at the top of the stairs opening. Wait. I wiped tears out of my eyes. Val stood leaning against the open door. You have a friend at the department, right? I asked. Val's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. A detective, she said. Can you tell him to look into a man named Reuben Chalmers? The Wiccan Festival guy? He confronted me in a parking lot and told me to stop asking questions about Angela Miller. I think he knows something. How exactly did he? It doesn't matter, I said. And there's something else. My friend Mel made a police report. She saw someone in a black mask carrying Zev out of the burning building. I think Burke dismissed her statement. He said she was just some co-ed. Can you make sure your contact follows up on what she said? Her name is Melanie Maldonado. Val glared at me. What exactly have you been up to? It doesn't matter. It's over, I said. I'll leave it alone from here on out. Val sighed. Reuben Chalmers and Melanie Maldonado, she said. I'll make sure the police look into it. What about Isabel? I asked. I'll go talk to her, Val said. If she knows something, I'll help her take it to the police. I nodded and then turned away from Val to look down the stairs again. I didn't want her seeing me wiping my eyes. Of course, she could probably tell what I was doing, but I didn't want to face her while doing it. I hated the fact that Val was right. I hated not being able to help look for Zev. I wanted to at least do something. Of course, that was the reason why Val had decided I couldn't be involved. Maybe Val was right. Maybe I needed to go home. Because if someone had kidnapped or even murdered Zev, I had just spent the past 2 days kicking a hornet's nest. I had already been threatened by a creep 2 nights ago. It was probably safer for me to get out of the state while the police investigated. I could come back once things had died down. But I hated the idea of going back home. Only, what else was I going to do? Where was I going to sleep? This stupid state apparently had a limit on the amount of time you could spend at rest stops, but if I started driving back to Indiana now, I could find a truck stop in Pennsylvania by nightfall, a well-lit place with a convenience store and an attendant on site 24 hours a day. I would be safe there. If I ponied up a couple bucks, I could even take a shower in the morning. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay. I wanted to help, to do something, to help fill the paper, if nothing else. I felt like if I didn't have any work to do, I was going to go crazy. I turned back to Val. She was still standing there, watching me. I don't want to go on leave. I can at least, I started. No, Elle, Val snapped. My vision blurred with more stupid tears. Tears that were making me look pathetic in front of my editor. No wonder she wasn't letting me help. Val's tone softened, which stung me. She was treating me like I was fragile. She didn't think I was strong enough. You have to go home and get some rest, Val said. Spend some quality time with your dad. And after all this is... well, after it's resolved, if you still want to come back and work here, I've got a pull-out couch. It's yours until you find a new place to stay. I turned away from Val and stared into the empty stairwell. I wanted to thank her, but I couldn't. I could feel the tightness in my throat. If I said anything, Val would hear that tightness, and she had probably already seen the tears in my eyes. I didn't want her seeing me this way. She was my boss. Or maybe she was more than that. Val was treating me like family, offering me a place to stay. But I still couldn't bring myself to let her hear my voice cracking with emotion, and I didn't trust my voice to speak without exposing me. So I kept my head down and let the silence hang in the air. You can take a minute, Val said. I should go talk to that woman. I nodded and kept facing away from her. I didn't turn around until after I heard the door open and close again. I wiped my eyes and slumped down to sit on the stairs. Was Zev already dead? No, I couldn't believe that. That would be giving up on him. I couldn't do that, not unless the police found a body. Until that happened, I had to believe Zev was alive. I wouldn't give up on him. Val said that she would make sure the police looked into what Mel had reported and that Chalmers was investigated. She had a contact in the department. She would be able to make sure the police followed up on those leads. And Zev might just be in hiding. He had been carried out of the fire, when leaving him in it would have been the perfect way to make his death look like an accident. So even if he had been kidnapped, his captors wanted him alive. I wiped more stupid tears out of my stupid eyes, and then I clenched my fists and looked down at my laptop bag. I hated this. I hated feeling powerless. I hated it so much I wanted to scream. There had to be something I could do. Anything. I couldn't just sit and be useless waiting for Zev to show up. Maybe there was something I could do. What if Isabel wouldn't talk to Val? Val had told me to go home, but she couldn't make me. I had the casino parking lot, at least for 2 weeks. Isabel was already scared, and that was before a dog had attacked her. She would be shaken up. But I was the one who had kicked that dog away from Isabel. That ought to be worth something, right? Maybe it would give Isabel a reason to trust me. What if I was the only person who could get her to share what she knew? I loosened my fists and let out a breath. I felt a calm descending on me. I had a goal now, something to focus on. I was going to go to the parking lot and wait for Isabel to come out. When she did, I would offer her a ride, get her talking, find out what she knew and whether or not she had already told Val. If she knew something that could save Zev, I had to convince her to share it with the police, or at least with Val, so Val could pass the information on. It wasn't much, but it was something. A task to keep my mind occupied, to keep the guilt and grief at bay. I took in a breath, wiped my eyes again, and carried my laptop bag down the stairs. Chapter 14. I jolted in surprise after opening the driver's side door to my van. Someone was inside. I was about to jump back a step before I recognized the blonde woman lying in the passenger seat. Isabel was gingerly holding her bandaged arm and had reclined the passenger seat so that she was impossible to see through the windows, unless you were tall and close enough to get a good angle. Isabel met my eyes and said in an anxious whisper, "I'm sorry. I left my door unlocked. I didn't realize at first, but, well..." I blinked at her as my whirling thoughts coalesced. If Isabel was here, she had slipped away before Val had a chance to talk to her. She must have run off the moment she had been left alone. Isabel had originally decided to meet with me because she wanted to convince me to stop asking questions about Angela Miller. She definitely knew more about what was going on. It was possible that she knew something crucial, something that the police needed to know. But if I just started interrogating her, I would scare her off. She was obviously very frightened and in pain. It was lucky for me that Isabel had left the van door unlocked by mistake. If she hadn't, the woman might have bolted for the nearest bus stop, and I wouldn't have this chance to get her talking. "I'm sorry," Isabel said. You've already done so much for me, but do you think you could give me a ride?" What I needed to do was carefully build up a rapport with the woman and then ease into asking questions. "Of course," I said. "I really am sorry," Isabel said. "It's really no big deal." "No, I mean for getting you fired." "What?" I overheard." "I'm not fired." "You're not?" "I'm on vacation," I said. "Involuntary vacation." "Oh," Isabel said. I didn't mean to cause you any trouble." "It wasn't your fault." Isabel bit her lip. "I hope that's true." she said. Silence hung in the air for a moment. You can just drop me off at the bus stop by the park. I frowned. You still need to get that vaccine. Isabel bit her lip for a moment before answering. I really don't think the dog was rabid, she said. How would you know? I demanded, an edge of irritation entering my voice. My temper was getting the better of me. I was on a short fuse. My emotions were a whirling tempest. I was terrified for Zev and furious with Val, even though I knew she was just trying to protect me. I could see that the edge in my voice was making Isabel nervous, but the trepidation in her expression didn't dissuade me. I knew the woman had been through a lot in the past few hours, but she might die without that rabies vaccine. Look, I can drive you down to Fairview, I said. You can't also have an ex down there, right? In the back of my mind, I knew I was being too aggressive, at least if my primary goal was to get Isabel to open up to me. But at the same time, I felt sure that she was lying about her reasons for wanting to avoid the hospital, and I was struggling to have any patience for whatever game she was playing. Isabel looked away from me, still biting her lip. I noticed that the bright blue sports bra she was wearing was flecked with dried blood. I forced my tone to be gentle yet firm. Whoever you're afraid of, do you think Fairview is far enough away from them? We can go farther. I know you're scared, but you need that shot. I know, Isabel said. I promise I'll go, but you don't need to take me. I shrugged. I sorta don't have anything better to do, I said. I can take care of myself. I really don't mind. I don't want to put you in any danger. Well, if another dog comes after you, you'll be glad to have me around. I had meant it as a joke, but Isabel didn't laugh. You don't understand. So explain it to me. I have a car, Isabel said. You can just take me there. I don't think you should be driving with your arm hurt like that, I said. And you lost some blood. You might be lightheaded. I'll be okay. I sighed. I would have to try a different approach with her. I wasn't going to convince her by arguing with her. So I decided to tell her the truth. Look, I said, I think something happened to my friend, another reporter who was working with Angela Miller on a story. I understand that there might be risks here, that there might be people who don't want you talking to me. I took a deep breath and continued. But I have to do something. My editor put me on leave because she thinks I'm going to be too worried about my friend to be able to help. But I can't just sit on my ass, not when he's still missing. Isabel turned toward me. I looked Isabel in the eyes and leaned forward. I need to do something useful, I said. So let me help you. It'll give me something to do. Isabel looked down at her bandaged arm and winced. Then she looked back up at me. At least let me pay for your gas, she said. The sun continued rising into the sky as I made the drive back to Fairview. I only realized after I had already offered to drive Isabel down there that I was going to have to take her back to Riverside at the end of the night before heading back to Fairview myself so that I could sleep in the casino parking lot. It would be a lot of driving, but if there was any chance I could convince the woman to share what she knew, it would be worth it. Even though the radio was playing classic rock, I could feel a silence hanging in the air. Isabel and I had already talked about the weather, about what local restaurants were good, and even about which radio stations we liked. That last subject had given us an excuse to stop talking and let the music play, but there was only so long you could go listening to the radio without speaking before it began to feel awkward, especially when you were sitting next to someone you had just met a few hours ago. I may know what I'm doing when I interview someone with a list of prepared questions, but I suck at small talk. But small talk was what I needed to build a rapport and get Isabel to trust me. We had already exhausted all the obvious conversation topics I could think of. What was I supposed to do next? Ask her about her family? I worried that might be a sore subject. On the other hand, I also worried that I was stereotyping her based on her choice of profession. Surely all strippers didn't have strained relationships with their families, but I imagined that a lot of parents wouldn't approve of that career choice. So maybe there was some truth in the stereotype. No, asking about her family was too risky. I was still racking my brain for conversation topics when Isabel broke the silence. So, she said, "Yeah? Can I ask you something?" Thank God, I thought. "Sure," I said. Don't take this the wrong way, but is everything going okay?" I frowned and didn't answer for a second. Things clicked into place. "You saw the mattress, didn't you?" I didn't mean to violate your privacy," Isabel said. I didn't realize that there would be anything private behind the curtain. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "Hey," I said, cutting her off. "It's okay. No big deal." Okay," Isabel said. Another uncomfortable silence hung over a guitar solo. "I'm doing okay," I said. "It's just that the place I was living burned down a few days ago, and I'm still getting things together." "Oh," Isabel said. "Yeah, I heard about the fire. It was a big one, wasn't it?" "Yeah," I said. Another silence hung in the air as I searched for words that could make the fact that I was living in my van seem less strange. "Are you a student?" Isabel asked. Not exactly," I said, without thinking. Why hadn't I just said yes? It wasn't like Isabel was going to ask me for my student ID. The more I talked about how unusual my living situation was, the more I would make myself sound unreliable. But it was too late now. I had to try to explain. "I was staying with a friend," I said. "I just graduated last year, and we've been roommates for a while." "Oh," Isabel said. "And well, after the fire, I thought, I've already got the van, so I got a mattress." I was lying about the mattress being a recent addition to the back of the van, but I thought I would come off sounding like even more of a weirdo if I tried to explain that it had just kind of worked out that I already had the mattress in the back of the van. Of course, now I had to worry that something in my tone of voice was going to give away the fact that I was telling a lie. This was why I preferred to just tell the truth, but it was difficult when the truth would make me sound like a weirdo, which probably was the truth, but it wouldn't help me earn the woman's trust. Another silence hung in the air. Damn it, I was definitely losing ground. "It just seemed like a good way to save some money," I said. I had to find some way to explain. "I understand what it's like to struggle," Isabel said. "Really? But don't you, I had reacted without thinking, but cut myself off. I didn't want to offend the woman, but I had assumed that stripping paid pretty well. The blonde woman in the passenger seat laughed, and I was filled with relief. "Well," Isabel said, "not as much anymore. Not financially, anyway, but I spent some time waiting tables." I don't think there's anything wrong with what you do," I said awkwardly. "Don't worry," Isabel said. "I didn't think you did." "Is it?" I fumbled. I was curious, but I didn't know how to phrase the question politely. Now that I thought about it, there probably was no polite way to ask Isabel if her job was as disgusting and unpleasant as I imagined it to be. Fortunately, Isabel started answering, releasing me from the obligation of finishing my question. "It's," Isabel said, "not glamorous. A lot of drug addicts, a lot of obnoxious guys, people who judge you for working there but don't judge themselves for being a customer." "That actually kind of sounds like the summer I worked at Taco Town," I said dryly. I glanced at Isabel. The blonde woman was grinning, a real, genuine grin, one that made her whole face light up. I smiled too. "So," Isabel said, "what's it like being a reporter?" I laughed. "Also not glamorous," I said. The conversation was flowing. We managed to keep it going, swapping work stories until we reached Fairview. I told a few stories about Zev, laying more groundwork to motivate Isabel to tell me if she knew anything that could help him. But I didn't ask her about Zev or Angela directly. Not yet. She needed that vaccine, and I didn't want to spook her or make her feel pressured until after her injury was taken care of. I pulled into the parking lot of the hospital and we went into the emergency room. I was anticipating a long wait, but Isabel was admitted after only 15 minutes, leaving me in the waiting room. I sat there, just blankly staring at the wall for a while. I was still feeling overwhelmed by what Val had told me. Zev was alive. I had to believe that. I wasn't going to give up on him. And I had told Val everything I had known that might be helpful. She had the stuff I had found on Zev's laptop, and she would make sure the police investigated Reuben Chalmers and didn't ignore the report they had taken from Mel. I wished I could at least keep working to keep my mind occupied, but when I checked the email on my phone, my inbox was empty. My inbox was never empty. Val must have already asked the IT guy to set my email address to forward everything to Val. That was what we did when someone went on vacation, but it had only been an hour. Val had moved fast. So I was sitting in a room with nothing to do. It had actually been a while since I'd been in that situation. As a reporter, there was always something to do. It wasn't like I never took time to watch something dumb on television or read a book, but every time I knew I had work waiting for me. Being a reporter wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It was a lifestyle. Every minute, an email could come through, and you had to be ready to jump in the car and drive to get the story. Even on a day off, the emails kept pouring in, and I kept replying to them. I was always panning for gold, waiting for the next big score, the next story that really mattered. Of course, mostly it was local fundraisers and people complaining about how they didn't want new developments near their homes during planning and zoning meetings. Was I just fooling myself, feeling like my job mattered? And there were waitresses that made more money than I did. My dad had shown me online wage data when I had made the mistake of proudly telling him that I had been hired for a few bucks above minimum wage. And with the Sentinel in financial trouble, my salary wasn't going up anytime soon. The publisher had handed the wheel over to the head of advertising. It was a move that reeked of desperation. What would I do if I lost my job? "Are you okay?" I snapped my head up to see Isabel looking down at me. Her bandages had been changed, and she was smiling sadly at me. "I should be asking you that," I said. "I'm okay. They gave me a couple shots. I'm supposed to change my bandages at least twice a day and come back in if it looks infected." "More than one shot?" "A tetanus booster too, I guess." "I see." "You kinda look upset." I shook my head. "I'm okay," I said. "It's just—" I hesitated. If I told Isabel I was worried about Zev, it might manipulate her into helping. It felt like a shitty thing to do, but I cared enough about the guy that I was willing to be an asshole if I needed to. I was about to open my mouth when Isabel beat me to it. "You're worried about that other reporter," Isabel said. I nodded. "Angela told me about him," Isabel said. Then she leaned forward to whisper in my ear, "I think we need to talk in private." Chapter 15. Isabel was glancing anxiously around the parking garage as we walked back to the van. The woman's anxiety was contagious. I found my own eyes scanning the area too. But what was I looking for? The same rabid dog that had attacked us before? We were in a parking garage miles from Riverside. Part of me still wondered if the attack really had been a random incident. After all, people did train attack dogs. No, that was too crazy. If there was a criminal conspiracy in Riverside protecting an underground prostitution ring, I could accept that. But if that conspiracy also employed dog trainers who sent canine assassins after anyone who went to meet a reporter in a park, well, it was laughable. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight before pulling open the rear doors of the van and stepping inside. Isabel followed me and pulled the doors closed behind her as I kicked off my shoes and sat down on the mattress. Behind me, Isabel was still standing in a crouch and staring at the doors she had just closed warily, as though worried they weren't secure enough. "Do you want to sit?" I asked. Yes," Isabel said. She walked over and knelt into a cross-legged position beside me on the mattress, slipping her own shoes off as she did so. I resisted the urge to bite my lip or to glance around nervously. This felt very weird. But Isabel was the one who had wanted to talk in the back of the van, where no one could see us. It was an odd request, but I had gone along with it out of eagerness to put the woman at ease so that she would open up to me. Isabel edged toward me, and I scooted back, freeing up more room on the mattress for her. But after I did it, I immediately felt self-conscious for moving away from her. I didn't want her to take that the wrong way. "There's plenty of room," I said. "I mean, I don't want to be, hogging all of the, you know?" Ugh, I was babbling. Isabel smiled, but I could see tension in the corners of her expression. I felt a strange urge to start cracking my knuckles or to start fidgeting with the blankets. I suppressed the urge and nodded at Isabel, inviting her to speak. She took in a deep breath. "I don't know how to explain this," Isabel said. She leaned closer to me, her brown eyes wide with apprehension. "I think it's better if I just..." Instead of finishing her sentence, Isabel raised one of her hands between us, palm up. I stared at her hand for a second. She was flexing her fingers as though grasping at the air. What was she doing? Did she want me to hold her hand? To comfort her? Isabel was staring intently at her hand. Her fingers bent and flattened a couple more times. After an uncomfortably long moment, she huffed out a breath and let her arm fall to her side with a heavy sigh. I just stared at her in confusion. What the hell had that been about? Was Isabel making a dramatic gesture while searching for words? If that's what it was, she had looked like an amateur actor chewing the scenery, staring at her hand and clawing at the air. That gesture also seemed out of character for the woman. Isabel hadn't talked with her hands much before this moment. The strangeness of it made me feel a little bit more suspicious about Isabel's paranoid behavior. Why had she wanted to talk in a place without any windows? If she had something to tell me and was worried about being overheard, she could have just told me while we were driving back to Riverside on the highway. There was no way anyone would hear us. Still, Isabel probably knew about the illegal things Angela Miller had been doing, and she might even know about the corrupt official. That was on top of the fact that she was dealing with the pain and fear involved with being the victim of a rabid dog attack. She had reasons to be feeling paranoid and acting strangely. "Are you okay?" I asked. Isabel shrugged sheepishly. "Yes," she said. And then she cleared her throat and dropped her hand to her side. "I know this sounds crazy," she began, "and I can't prove anything." I leaned forward, eager to hear what she was about to tell me. "But before Angie disappeared, she was threatened." I nodded, a little disappointed. Was this all Isabel knew? "Yeah," I said. "Zev's notes mentioned that. Zev is..." "Zev Jackson," Isabel said. "The reporter Angie was working with." I nodded again. "I think Angie's dead," Isabel said. My eyes went wide, and dread soured the pit of my stomach. How did Isabel know that Angela Miller was dead? Was she sure of it? What about Zev? Was he? No, Zev was okay. If there was even a chance he was okay, I had to believe it. I couldn't give up on him. I had to keep trying to help him without letting doubt or hesitation stop me. The churning emotions in my chest got the better of me. "Isabel!" I burst out. You have to talk to the cops. If they knew everything you did straight from the sources— No, Isabel interrupted. We can't go to the police. But why not? They can't help us. Ah, Isabel was afraid of the cops. That made sense. That was why she hadn't gone to them when Angela Miller had gone missing. But I could reason with her. I know that Angela said that someone in a position of authority is corrupt, I said, but that doesn't mean they all are. If you don't want to go to the Riverside PD, we could go to a state trooper's office. And you could tell people at the newspaper, too. The more people who know about the accusations, the safer you'll be. No, Isabel said. It's not— There's no evidence anyway. There's you, I said. You can testify that Angela Miller was threatened, and now she's missing. And Zev Jackson has been officially reported missing, too. I think that's more than enough for you to be taken seriously. No, Isabel said. I think this may have happened because of what Angie was doing. I know about the prostitution already, I said. My editor knows too. What? Isabel said, alarmed. We saw Zev's notes, I explained. And that's even more evidence we can show the police to get them to take you seriously. Listen, we can do this right. My editor will know how to keep you safe. No, Isabel said. Her volume was still at a whisper, but her tone was high-pitched and terrified. This isn't why I came to talk. I just wanted you to stop before you get killed. Listen, I said. I know you're scared, but there are a lot of good cops in the Riverside Police Department. I know some of them. They can protect you. They can protect both of us. They can't, Isabel whispered. Not from this. I frowned at the woman sitting across from me. She was definitely terrified. But couldn't she see that she had to fight through her fear? The stakes were too high for Isabel to allow her emotions to control her. Isabel, I said, I know you're scared. No, Isabel interrupted. This is bigger than just Riverside, Eliza. It's global. I blinked at her. Global? Who did she think was behind the disappearances? The Illuminati? I said. What do you mean by global? Isabel sighed heavily. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I know. Then explain it. I can't, Isabel said. I suppressed an urge to clench my fists. I couldn't allow myself to get impatient and argumentative. That wouldn't help. Why not? I asked. Listen, Isabel said. I know you aren't going to like this, but there's nothing either of us can do to help Angie or Zev. There's nothing the police can do either. If you keep poking around, you're just going to get yourself killed. I frowned at the woman sitting across from me in the dimness. Her face was illuminated only by the flashlight on the phone that I had laid on the floor to function as a lamp. What had Isabel meant by global? If the woman believed in some kind of global conspiracy, it was possible that she didn't know anything useful after all. She might have only had a passing acquaintanceship with Angela Miller, just enough to hear that she had been talking to a reporter. I hadn't seen any proof that they were anything more than coworkers. Maybe after Angela Miller had disappeared, it had triggered Isabel's fears about Big Brother or lizard people or whatever, and so when I had gone into the club to start asking questions, Isabel had decided she needed to warn me about the global conspiracy. I still wanted to try to extract whatever information Isabel had on the chance it might be useful, but my skepticism was rising. And so was my frustration at how vague she was being. I searched for words, but Isabel was the one to break the silence first. Angie said she would be careful, she whispered. She said she wasn't scared. I don't think she told Zev everything, I said. And Zev should have told our editor what he was up to, but he didn't. I won't make those mistakes. Isabel just shook her head, looking stricken. You can trust me, I said. Do you know who Angela was afraid of? Isabel bit her lip. She looked like she was teetering on the edge of saying something. Impatience got the better of me, and I pressed her. Was it the deputy chief of the Riverside PD? I asked. Did you ever hear her mention the name Rudy Burke?" Isabel shook her head. I waited for her to speak, but she didn't say anything. "So it wasn't Burke," I pressed. Isabel just looked away from me. I was starting to feel increasingly annoyed. I could tell that Isabel was afraid, but there was no way that whispering something to me in the back of my van in a parking garage in Fairview could put anyone in danger. Did she imagine that this vast conspiracy had ears everywhere? That someone put a bug in my van? "What do you mean?" I demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" "I can't explain it," Isabel said. "You could try." Isabel bit her lip, still looking away from me. "You wouldn't understand," she said. My impulse was to get in her face, to press her harder until she broke down and shared whatever information she was keeping from me. But I knew that was the wrong approach. Isabel was frightened and upset, and even though I felt frustrated with her, I had to remember that she was acting this way because of fear, not malice. I forced myself to take a deep breath and attempted to push aside my impatience and irritation. Even if all Isabel was keeping from me was the details of a conspiracy theory she believed in, I had to get her to trust me. I had to confirm that Isabel didn't have any information that might help Zev. "Listen," I said, struggling to keep my voice gentle. "I don't want to put you in any danger." Isabel brought her knees up to her chest, as though to hide behind them. "Please," I said, "if you think you might know anything that might help the police find Zev, for all we know, it could mean the difference between life and death." I'm sorry. I wish I could help you." Isabel was clutching her arms around her knees and had started shaking a little. I couldn't clamp down on the rising wave of anger that swelled in my veins. "If you know something, the police might be able to help my friend before it's too late. If you don't help, whatever happens to him will be your fault." Somewhere in the back of my mind, part of me was trying to remind myself that getting angry wasn't helping. But that voice was a whisper underneath the cacophony of rage that demanded I scream at Isabel until she told me what she knew. "The cops can't do anything," Isabel whispered. "Maybe they can if they know more," I shot back. "Not before more people show up dead." A quiet part of me was starting to become more and more certain that Isabel was just a paranoid nut. But my anger was still in the driver's seat, egging me on. "We can't just run away!" I shouted. "If we just let the killer get away with it, how long before someone else disappears?" Isabel started shaking more violently. Her eyes looked wet. I'm just trying to keep us both safe." Tears started to roll down Isabel's cheeks. She was hugging her knees to her chest and shaking with sobs. I opened my mouth to yell something else at her, but the words died in my throat as I watched her start crying. My anger abruptly melted and froze into sharp, stabbing guilt. I had made the woman cry. Isabel buried her face behind her knees. I heard her inhale a ragged breath. Regret slugged me in the gut, a blow that made the icicle of guilt that was already in the pit of my stomach tear into me even more. I had acted like a bully. I still wanted Isabel to tell me what she knew, but I was disgusted with myself for the way I had gone about it. In my determination to help Zev, I had bullied a woman who might have a mental illness and made her cry. I'm sorry," I said. Isabel breathed in and out a couple of times. Her whole body was shaking enough that I could feel it through the mattress. "I'm sorry I yelled at you. I flinched when Isabel suddenly threw her arms around me. She shuddered, pressing her face into my shoulder. I could feel my shirt getting wet with her tears. I stiffened when she touched me, but quickly tried to relax. I lifted one arm to clumsily pat the woman on the back, feeling even more awkward about it than when Mel had hugged me, because the strap of the sports bra Isabel was wearing covered relatively little of her back, so the only way to put my arms around her was to touch her bare skin. but I shoved my discomfort aside. I had made this woman cry. I had a responsibility to try to make her feel better, to try to undo the emotional damage I had done. The skin of Isabel's back was soft, smooth, and a little sweaty. I hoped that Isabel hadn't noticed my initial reaction to when she threw herself at me. If she had noticed the way I had stiffened at her touch, she probably thought I was treating her like she was dirty because of her choice of profession. But that wasn't it. I just wasn't a touchy-feely person. And on top of that, part of me couldn't help but have an involuntary flash of auditory memory. For years, other girls in high school had taken to coughing the word dyke whenever I entered a room. Years later, that was still there in the back of my head. I pretended not to care what other people thought, but I was a fraud. "I'm sorry," I whispered to Isabel, continuing to pat her on the back. But I was sure that my bony torso was far from comforting. Isabel's body was the one that was soft and warm. Suddenly, Isabel pulled back from me. "I'm sorry," she said. That wasn't appropriate." "No," I said. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled at you." "I understand," Isabel said, wiping her eyes. "You're worried about your friend." I felt like an asshole. But now that Isabel wasn't actively crying, the guilt and shame that restrained me was starting to lift. "Isabel," I said gently, "I just want you to know that I'll keep anything you choose to tell me strictly between us unless you say it's okay to do otherwise." Isabel took a deep breath. She was still blinking tears out of her eyes, tears that I had caused. But I couldn't let that stop me from continuing. I had to do this, even if it made me the most cold-hearted bitch in the world. I had to do it. For Zev. "I really do believe that if you trusted me and my editor, we could get in touch with people who can keep us both safe." Isabel bit her lip and looked away from me. "I just don't want anyone else to die," she said. Her voice was tight. "But do you know that they're dead? If they're alive, they might need our help." Isabel just shook her head and wiped at her eyes. I felt the guilt icicle in my stomach twisting. "Would it change anything if I tell you that I'm not going to stop looking into this? I know you want me to leave it alone, but I can't. I won't." I folded my arms and gazed steadily at the woman. She turned her eyes toward me, and I stared into them, unwavering. Her brown eyes were wet and bloodshot, and it was my fault. But I couldn't relent. I kept staring at her until she looked away. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you," she said. "Try me," I insisted. Isabel sighed. "I wouldn't believe me either," she said. I know how it sounds." "Try me," I repeated. Isabel looked away from me. She pulled out her phone, apparently checking the time. "It will be late by the time we get back to Riverside," she said. "I have a couch you can sleep on. At least you'd be safe for one night." If it wasn't for how red her eyes still looked from crying, I probably would have gotten angry and impatient again. But even though my determination to do whatever was in my power to help Zev had trumped my guilt for making Isabel cry, it hadn't fully suppressed it. It was probably good that my temper was being restrained by my guilt. Isabel hadn't responded well to anger. "Please," I said, "if you just tell me what you know, I'll leave you alone forever. And I swear, I won't let anyone find out you talk to me." Isabel reached out and touched my knee. I suppressed the urge to flinch. "Listen," Isabel said, looking me right in the eyes. "Throwing your life away won't do anything to help anyone." I was taken aback by the calm assurance that had appeared in Isabel's voice and expression. There was something solid in her mannerism, as if she had come to an internal decision and that the act of doing so had filled her with leaden resolve. It threw me so far off balance that I just blinked at her. "But," Isabel said. "But?" I asked. But if you're sure I can't talk you out of it, I'll tell you what I know in the morning. My eyes lit up. Why not just tell me now? I will tell you in the morning, Isabel said firmly. I'm grateful for your help. She gestured, indicating her freshly bandaged arm. But if you aren't willing to wait, you're too impulsive, and I can't trust you. But, I began. That's my final offer, Isabel said. She stared at me with brown eyes as solid and unwavering as 100-year-old oak, and still bloodshot from the tears I had caused, red lines like veins in the wood. I broke away from Isabel's stare and turned my eyes down to the mattress I was sitting on. Isabel was going to share what she knew with me, but only if I agreed to wait, and to spend the night on her couch. It was a generous offer. It would save me from having to drive back down to Fairview after dropping her off, and it would be nice to have access to a bathroom that didn't require me to get fully dressed and put on shoes. On top of that, I really needed a shower. If Isabel was offering me a place to stay, she might let me use hers. But part of me felt suspicious. Maybe it was just because I had just been arguing with her, but was it possible that the offer would come with some hidden strings attached? Was Isabel just trying to sandbag me, to keep me waiting over and over until I gave up on trying to get her to open up to me? And then there was the fact that she had referenced some kind of global conspiracy, even if only briefly. But if she was so prone to paranoia, why was she inviting a stranger she had just met this morning into her home? And when she had decided to share the information with me if I agreed to wait overnight, she had seemed steady. Not like how I imagined a crazy person who believed in global conspiracies would be. Why do you want me to stay with you tonight? I asked. I'm worried about you. I'm doing fine, I said defensively. I've got a nice place to park overnight. It's not just that, Isabel said quickly. She bit her lip, looking at me searchingly. I had no idea what she was looking for. What then? I asked. I don't want to be alone tonight, Isabel said. Ah, the woman had been through a lot today, and I had protected her when the dog had attacked her. Well, if I accepted Isabel's offer, it would give me more time to probe her. But if I pressed her, I might fail the test she had set for me. She seemed to want me to prove my patience to her, or something. But if she knew something important, couldn't she see how it might be necessary to get that information to the police as soon as possible? Maybe whatever she knew wasn't that important. It could just be the exact details of the global conspiracy that she believed in. I wanted to find out if she knew anything useful in case the police needed it. But the police already had access to a lot of information. Val would have filled them in about Reuben Chalmers, who seemed like a strong lead. Given that, I could back off, at least for now, and if Isabel let me use her shower... But what was her place like? What if she was a hoarder with old pizza boxes and rotting bits of food covering up all the floors? Well, if Isabel's place was creepy or disgusting, I could simply walk out the door and leave, go back to the van and drive back down to the casino parking lot. I wanted to say yes, but I didn't want to sound like I really needed Isabel's help. I wanted her to know I'd be fine on my own. Why don't you let me think it over on the drive back? I said. Chapter 16. Isabel and I didn't talk much on the trip back to Riverside. We had exhausted a lot of the casual conversation topics on the way up, and I think Isabel sensed that I was still impatient for her to tell me what she knew. The more I thought about it, the more the woman flummoxed me. It made sense that being attacked and having a painful wound had left her feeling jumpy, but it was harder to understand why sharing information with me scared her so badly, and to square that with her steely gaze and her promise to tell me everything she knew tomorrow morning. It all came down to one thing she had said. This is global. That was what made her sound crazy. Everything else about her seemed normal enough. Was I misinterpreting her words? Did she misspeak? Did she really believe that a global conspiracy was at work in the disappearances of Zev and Angela Miller? But at the same time, she had said that she knew she sounded crazy. That seemed to indicate a level of self-awareness nutty conspiracy theorists didn't have. I was still lost in thought when we reached Riverside and Isabel started offering me directions. Her voice was polite, but a little tense. Isabel led us north, past Riverside and into Dover, and then up into the shadow of the hanging hills, where a pair of trap rock ridges met and walled off the settled areas from the wide expanse of national forest that surrounded the Riverside area. As we went farther into the hills, the pavement remained cracked and neglected, but the distance between houses started to increase, and fewer homes looked abandoned. Trees shadowed over the dangerously sharp curves of the narrow country roads that didn't even have streetlights. I could tell Isabel was starting to relax as we drew closer to her home, but I felt tense. There was something foreboding about driving deeper into the forest, especially as it was getting dark. Maybe it was just the memory of Chalmers melting into the trees 2 nights ago. I was starting to understand better why Isabel was feeling afraid about spending the night alone. If she lived by herself out in the boonies, it made sense for her to feel nervous after having been the victim of an animal attack. "It's coming up on the right," Isabel said. We turned around a bend, and I saw a narrow gravel driveway going up a hill. "Is this it?" I asked, trying to affect a neutral tone instead of a skeptical one. "Yeah, right up here," Isabel said. She sounded like she was proud of her home and eager to be returning to a place where she felt safe. I pulled into the driveway slowly and stopped the van, staring up the gravel path that curved and disappeared behind the trees and thick undergrowth. "Don't take this the wrong way," I said. "But?" Isabel asked. "But this is looking like the kind of place where zombie hillbillies could come after us and no one would hear us scream." Isabel snorted. "There are other people who live on this road," she said. "Like a football field away," I said. "Do you really think this place is safe?" "Not even my coworkers know about this place," Isabel said. "Everyone thought I lived with Angie." "What about property records?" "Except for Angie, everyone at work knows me as Lexi Cream." "Someone has to know your real name." "Just Angie. Oh, and Vince, I guess." "Doberman knows you live here?" "Yeah." "You really think—" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I didn't want to endorse Isabel's claims of a global conspiracy, but it seemed odd that she could believe in something like that while simultaneously putting her trust in a thug like Vince Doberman. "You don't think he's, involved?" "Vince works really hard to keep us safe at the club," Isabel said. I frowned at that. "He wouldn't hurt anyone," she said. "We are talking about a guy who moonlights as a bouncer in his own club," I said. "I'm sure he's been in some fights." "That's different," she said, folding her arms in front of her and frowning. "I know you haven't told me everything," I said, treading carefully. "But if someone wanted to stop Zev and Angie from telling people something, it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together. If news came out about something illegal going on at the club, that could really hurt Doberman's business. Vince would never hurt one of the girls. If prostitution was happening at the Dover Delight, Doberman had to know about it," I said. "He has a motive." "I trust him," Isabel insisted. I sighed and disengaged the parking brake. I wanted to try to persuade Isabel to tell me what she knew immediately, but I also knew that pressing her might convince her not to tell me at all. The van crawled up the hill and rounded a bend as a small building came into view. It was shaped like a barn, but was the size of a single wide trailer. Isabel's house was painted red and rested on a concrete pad large enough to fit a few patio chairs on either side of a door made from old and faded-looking wood. I didn't know what I had expected a stripper's home to look like, but it hadn't been a miniature version of the standard New England quaint old barn with a roof that had solar panels on it. "It looks nice," I said. Privately, I thought the place looked a little kitschy, though well-maintained. It did not look like the home of an unstable hoarder, at least not from the outside. Isabel smiled. It's not much, but I own it outright. That's great. Are you coming inside? Do you still want me to? Isabel put her hand on my arm. You've done so much for me today. Of course I do. The blue and white tile in Isabel's bathroom matched the colors of the shower curtain, which was patterned with seashells that themselves matched a jar of shells sitting next to the sink. It was clear Isabel had put a lot of effort into her home. Her home was an oasis, perhaps a place to escape the seedy world of her workplace. I felt awkward as I stripped out of my clothes. I felt like I didn't belong in this bathroom. It was too fancy, too nice, and it belonged to a person who I was being a manipulative asshole to. Because the main reason I had convinced myself to accept a shower and a hot meal from Isabel was that I had realized that it was a good strategic move toward convincing her to share whatever information she had with me tonight, instead of making me wait until tomorrow morning. In a political science class, I had heard about the Ben Franklin effect, named for the man because he had described it in one of his pithy epigrams. It was this theory that if you do someone a favor, it makes them like you a little, but if you let someone do you a favor, it makes them like you a lot, and the person feels more inclined to help you again in the future. Getting is better than giving. It sounds ass backwards, but I thought I remembered that some psychological study said that it worked. At the very least, it was worth a try. I had helped Isabel take care of her arm, but I hadn't let her do anything for me, at least not until now. If Ben Franklin was right, maybe letting Isabel cook me dinner and lend me her shower would put her in a more helpful frame of mind. Or maybe Ben Franklin was full of crap. I guess I'd find out. I had even asked Isabel if I could use her shampoo and conditioner to go all in on Ben Franklining her. Still, I felt like a jerk. Not enough to be dissuaded, I still felt compelled to get Isabel to open up to me as fast as possible, on the off chance she knew something that could help Zev, but enough to feel guilty as I carried out my manipulative plan. I got the water going and put my hand in to test the temperature. It warmed up almost immediately. I closed my eyes and stepped into the shower, pulling the curtain closed behind me. Thought fled as I let the hot water pour over me for a while. It was nice to forget about everything and just drink in the sensation of pouring heat. Isabel kept a very nice home, one that seemed like the product of a well-ordered mind. So why had Isabel insisted on going into the back of the van before refusing to tell me anything? There was a possibility I hadn't considered. Believing in a global conspiracy wasn't insane if Isabel was right. What if there really was some kind of international prostitution or human trafficking organization involved in the disappearances? It would explain why Isabel was too afraid to go to the police or the media. She didn't want to take on an international crime ring single-handedly. I frowned to myself as I pulled on a fresh set of clothes, jeans and a long-sleeved green shirt. A sizzling sound permeated the air as I stepped out of the bathroom, bringing with it the smell of onions and cumin. The bathroom led to an extremely short hallway between Isabel's room and the main space where the kitchen stood open to the living room. The furniture was covered with red upholstery that somehow made you think of the red barn style on the outside of the trailer. Fancy candles squatted on the coffee table, the kind that come from froofy candles-only retailers who named all their merchandise in ways that failed to explain what the candles smelled like, things like comforting winter hearth and fresh spring sunrise. So this was what Isabel spent her money on. She had enough to not only own her own place, but also to decorate it. Even though the aggressively quaint style wasn't something I would have chosen myself, I couldn't help but feel a little envious. The woman herself stood in the kitchen, her hair still damp from her own shower. She was pushing a spatula around in a cast iron pan with a relaxed look on her face. A red bathrobe that looked like it was made of silk hung from her shoulders, down to past her knees. One sleeve of the bathrobe was a bit puffier from the fresh gauze I had helped her wrap around her right arm, but the wound didn't seem to be hurting her enough to stop her from using that hand to put away a spice jar. "Smells good," I said. A grin spread across Isabel's cheeks as she set down her spatula. "Thanks, it's almost ready." A flicker of motion outside the kitchen window behind Isabel caught my eye. Something moving in the darkness of the trees. It rushed out of sight before I could get a good look at it. Was it the size of a person? Or had it just been a coyote or something like that? I rushed over to the window. "What? Is something wrong?" I thought I saw something moving outside," I said. Shattering glass made me spin around toward the living room. Glass shards scattered across the floor. My eyes snapped up to the empty window pane and the huge thing that had broken through the glass. I saw a pale brown muzzle stretching out of an enormous head covered in dark fur. For a moment, I thought the animal was a giant black dog, even bigger than the dog that had attacked Isabel earlier. But the shape of the head was different, not canine. The animal looked at me with huge, beady brown eyes, and I realized what it was. A black bear was sticking its head through the living room window. The hulking animal looked at me for a second, and then it laid its paws on the windowsill, apparently preparing to climb into the house through the tiny opening. I heard Isabel scream, a prolonged, terrified scream that drove a cold spike of fear into my back. I felt blood pounding in my ears. Time slowed down. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The window was on the same side of the house as the only exterior door. I felt like a cornered animal, a primal terror that galvanized me into action. I realized as it was happening that I was running toward the bear, adrenaline carrying me forward before I had a chance to second-guess myself. I didn't even know what I was going to do until I had rushed 2 steps forward and already started to grab the first object that my hands could find, a large ceramic table lamp. I felt something sharp underneath one of my feet, but I ignored the pain as I swung the lamp wildly and threw it a few feet through the air to crash against the bear's head. The lamp shattered, and the beast recoiled in apparent pain, but after a second of rearing back, it shrugged off the blow and turned its eyes toward me. The bear knew that I had attacked it, and it was pissed. The creature bared its enormous teeth and roared at me. The black bear's roar sounded like nothing I had ever heard. The roar was a throbbing, undulating sound. At first, I thought the bear was crying out in pain, but the threat from its bared teeth made the message clear. I don't think I can convey how terrifying that sound was. It thrummed against something primitive deep inside me. My hair stood on end, and I nearly fell to my knees and cowered underneath the dining table. The fact that the sound of the bear's roar was so unfamiliar made it all the more alarming. Later, I found out that a lot of movies and TV shows use the sound of a wolf's growl when they need to indicate that a bear is angry. A wolf's growl sounds like a deeper version of the family dog's growl, so it's familiar, and you know what it means when you hear it. But a bear is not a dog or even a wolf. It's a much, much bigger animal. I just stood there, frozen. The bear was staring at me, maybe trying to gauge my reaction to its roar. And my reaction was abject terror. I couldn't move. My body was frozen. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. The bear had barely noticed the lamp I had thrown at it. If I hadn't nailed it in the face, the bear might not have reacted at all. Even though I was only seeing the animal's head and front paws, I could feel viscerally that it was much bigger and stronger than I was. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to even blink. The bear stared back at me for a moment. For a second, I thought I saw something green glinting in the pupils of its eyes, but I must have imagined it. The bear and I stared at one another, motionless. And then the huge animal pulled its head back out of the window and into the darkness. I just stared at the jagged edges of glass in the shattered window frame. I felt like I had been welded to the floor. I could feel something sharp poking into my foot, but the pain seemed distant and unimportant. Slowly, my mind began to process thoughts other than adrenaline-soaked terror. I managed to lift my foot away from the shard of glass that I had stepped on. The bear was still outside. Was it running away? Or was it still out there, waiting? I took in a breath. The food was still sizzling on the stove. The sound of it made me remember that I wasn't alone. I whipped my head around to look for Isabel. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that she wasn't standing at the stove where I had last seen her, but then I caught sight of the red bathrobe and saw Isabel on the floor in front of the refrigerator. She was curled with her knees up against her chest and a chef's knife gripped in both hands. I felt like I should say something to her, but before I could find the words, I was interrupted by a sudden crash of splintering wood and screeching metal. I whipped my head around and saw Isabel's front door exploding inwards. The door tore from its hinges and slammed against the floor between me and Isabel. The huge black bear followed the door inside, forelegs slamming its weight against it and riding the door down to pound the floor with a crash. I heard Isabel scream again. The bear turned its head toward her and opened its mouth to let loose another roar, the sound still startlingly unfamiliar in the way it throbbed and undulated like a struggling engine. When it was over, I heard a metallic thud as the knife fell from Isabel's shaking grip and hit the floor. The bear was still looking at her. It wasn't looking at me. I could back away, just back away and hope that the beast didn't notice me. No, I had to do something. I had to help Isabel. We both had to get out of here, get to the van, and drive off. But the bear was standing between us. And at the very thought of confronting the huge animal, I felt my legs start to shake and wobble. It was all I could do to stay on my feet. I wanted to run past the bear, through the shattered remains of the doorway and off into the night. If I did that, I would be leaving Isabel for dead. I couldn't let myself do that. But I also couldn't move. I could see how massive and strong the bear was, much bigger and stronger than that dog had been. Kicking the bear would just make it angry. I watched, frozen, as the huge animal lunged toward the woman cowering in front of the refrigerator. She shrieked and curled herself into a ball against the fridge, her face buried so that she couldn't see what was about to happen to her. My arms and legs were shaking. I couldn't breathe. The bear bounded until the huge beast was standing over her, its teeth bared. Isabel was shaking with fear. I had to do something. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The bear lifted a paw and slammed it down at Isabel. Its sharp claws easily tore through the thin bathrobe and ripped into the flesh of Isabel's back. Isabel screamed. I could hear the pain and terror in her voice. The ice in my lungs shattered, and I managed to pull in a breath. The act of taking in air melted the lead in my arms and legs. I could feel my toes pressing into the floor beneath my feet. I knew that I could move. I could run if I wanted to. I shifted my weight on one foot, and then the other whipped suddenly forward, until, suddenly, I was sprinting across the room. I tried to ignore the magnetic pull of the shattered doorway and the darkness outside where I knew my van was waiting for me. I could feel the keys in my pocket. I had to focus on the sound of Isabel's pained screams. The bear was standing on 3 of its legs. It started to raise its right forepaw to strike again at the helpless, cowering woman on the floor in front of it. 3 bounding steps were all it took to reach the animal. I didn't have a plan. I just had primal terror and aggression. I found myself swinging one foot out to kick at the bear's head, aiming for the neck. The bear's head was turning toward me. It had heard me coming and was turning to look at me. My kick landed on the bear's cheek, centimeters away from a mouth that could have opened and seized my leg with long, sharp teeth. I had thrown the whole weight of my body into the kick, and it wasn't enough to knock the bear down. And I had thrown the attack without any kind of control. I was overbalanced, and my body followed my leg forward. I fell to the floor, barely managing to fling out my arms and catch myself on my hands and knees. Behind me, Isabel was crawling toward the hallway that went to her bedroom and the bathroom. I started to get up. If Isabel could hide in her bedroom and close the door, maybe I could lure the bear outside and... I didn't have a plan. Before I could form one, I felt a huge paw slam into my ribcage, knocking me onto the ground. I fell onto my side and rolled onto my back, gasping. The wind had been knocked out of me, and I was stunned. I could feel the huge animal's paws slamming the floor on either side of my hips as it came to stand over me, trapping my body beneath its massive bulk. The bear's head loomed over me. Its teeth were bared. I shouted wordlessly and flung my arms forward, vainly trying to protect my head and neck from the bear's jaws. That was when it happened. There was no rational thought in that moment. The fear was too overwhelming. Even though I had no sense of my usual internal narrative, I did have absolute clarity of perception. Adrenaline slowed down time and showed the bear's jaws moving toward me. I could feel my entire body shaking. I could hear the sound of my own voice bellowing. I could hear Isabel screaming something, words maybe, but the capacity to understand language was something that existed outside of this moment. A light flashed from Isabel's direction, bright, as if from a camera. I had no idea what Isabel was doing or why. The flash of light was strange, but nothing could distract me from the sight of the huge teeth descending toward me, huge yellow-white spikes that were about to tear into me. I was more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. When you see jaws descending to rip chunks out of your flesh, you aren't a person in that moment. You're just another mammal. It hits you at the core, a fear so deep and instinctual that it's like your mind leaves your body. All that's left is dread and anticipation of an agonizing death, of having your body torn into by a creature that you can only hope will kill you before it starts to eat you. But in that moment of absolute terror, there was something else I felt, an electric tension in the air, like when your fingers brush against a tiny amount of static. I could feel it on my skin, in my lungs, and flowing through my veins, a pulsing sort of energy. Every action I had taken so far had been instinctual and unplanned, and this was no different. My arms were flung out in front of my face, and I wanted nothing more than to put something, anything, between myself and the bear. I felt a surging pressure behind my eyes, and then I felt the pulsing sensation rise up in my chest and surge up and into my arms, rushing out of my body at breakneck speed. There was a blinding flash of light, brighter than the sun. I heard a crackling electric sound, like a taser switching on and off. My eyes were blinded by the flash. I heard paws slamming the floor and flailed out with my arms and legs in reflexive terror. I felt my feet striking against something huge and solid. I couldn't see, but I could hear the thumping of the paws on the ground. It sounded like the bear was stepping back, away from me. I kept flailing my arms and legs until I was striking at nothing but empty air. I still couldn't see, but at least I could use my swinging limbs to detect that the animal was no longer looming over me. My vision slowly began to clear, and I could vaguely make out the shape of the bear running out of Isabel's front door. I felt a wetness on my stomach, and at first I thought that the bear actually had bitten me and that I somehow hadn't noticed out of shock. But when I reached down to touch my stomach, it was intact, but wet. Was that blood? No, not blood. I was covered in cold, damp sweat. And I was still alive. Relief flooded tears down my cheeks, and I started laughing out loud. The stench of burnt hair filled my nostrils, and I just kept giggling. I didn't feel any kind of amusement. My lungs and throat simply shook themselves rhythmically, almost as if they were testing whether or not they still worked. My ears were still ringing when Isabel started crying out, Eliza! Oh my God, Eliza, are you okay? The blonde woman was standing over me. Eliza, listen to me. You have to watch my hands. Did she want me to count her fingers? I didn't think I had a concussion. I wanted to tell Isabel that I was all right, but something about the fact that she was worried made me laugh even harder. Laughter was life. I was alive. Isabel knelt beside me and held her palms out in front of my face. I blinked up at them, the light from the bedroom door casting dim shadows on her skin. That was when things started to get really weird. Light and shadow played across Isabel's hand, shimmering and collecting into a tiny, white ball of illumination. The light floated just below Isabel's hand, like a firefly. I stopped laughing and just stared at the light in confusion. A moment passed. There was still a light floating in Isabel's hand. I blinked. The light was still there. I blinked again. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The adrenaline was fading. The light was still floating underneath Isabel's hand, like a tiny cartoon pixie. I managed to get control over my vocal cords. "The hell?" I said. This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran, narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.